I'm John Petter's G3YPZ. I've been licensed since 1969 and enjoyed many years of operating on a mode which we call amplitude modulation, ancient modulation, angel's music, or just AM. It might seem a little bit perverse doing that in 2020 when we've got very efficient modes such as single sideband, which has been around since the 1930s and takes up a lot less space on the bands and is much more efficient. But AM provides an easy way to get on the bands. It's easy equipment to construct and homebrew, and it's a lot of fun. And the audio quality can be quite amazing as well. So let's just give you a taster of what's possible with a handful of watts, a reasonable antenna, and this ancient modulation mode. Here's a couple of recordings from the last solar cycle on 10 meters of some transatlantic contacts.
We put our clocks back to standard time last night, so the local time here is now 10:30. Running a DX100, 100 watts, a 3-element TA33 Moseley tri-bander at about 15 metres above the ground, and the receiver's a Hamelin SP600. Back to you then. Sugar Quebec 5, Echo Bravo Mike, VE30WV.
On there that I like, so to look at are on there, so it's quite useful, the laptop, and I can take it out to the shack as well, outside shack, and it works well out there. So I don't need any wires or anything with it. Right, Nick, in case the band changes, I'll put it back to you. Victor Echo 2 Oscar Whiskey Victor, GW8 TBG.
So there we have two examples of AM contacts going across the pond. The first recording is of Nick, VE30WV in Ontario, very well-known AM operator, who's an ex-G8, and GW8 TBG, Mervyn from South Wales, who is a regular AM operator, who I work on both 80 metres and 60 metres at times. And you heard Mervyn recorded over in the States from his vintage equipment, and Nick recorded in Poland. Both of those contacts are typical of what is possible on 10 metres and also on 15 metres, and will be happening during the coming solar cycle, which has just started to erupt at the moment. Well, what about the beginnings of AM? Well, that goes way back to about the year 1900, and a Professor Fessenden who experimented with an early form of AM on a spark transmitter. It wasn't greatly successful, but he had later success with different techniques. But it wasn't until the thermionic valve, or tube as the Americans call it, was invented, that you began to get the possibility of good quality audio modulated onto an RF carrier. And radio amateurs were at the forefront of this during the early 1920s and were at the very beginnings of broadcasting. We all know about 2LO, which later became the BBC station, and Gerald Marcus, G2NM, very famous amateur, was involved in the very early days doing Empire broadcasting. We were able to transmit music as well as speech. But later on it was regulated, and of course we come down to amateur radio as we know it now, which is communications between two stations. So let's have a look at what an AM signal consists of. It's two parts. You generate the RF signal, the unmodulated carrier, and you generate an audio signal. And our audio signal is going to be a 1 kilohertz tone. So what we do is we impose the 1 kilohertz tone onto the carrier. So the first thing you see at the top of the diagram there is the audio tone. The second waveform is the RF carrier. The third waveform is the combination of the two modulated to 50%, and the bottom one is 100% modulation, and you'll see that the peaks go much higher and that the carrier level goes down to the zero baseline, and you certainly don't want to go above that because you end up flat topping and the carrier breaking up and causing splatter and distortion. Let's now look at our AM signal in terms of spectrum use. we have, looking at that diagram, a carrier in the centre, and you will notice two sidebands that are each of 25% of the power of the carrier. So already you're looking at an inefficient way of transmitting, because the intelligibility in that signal is only in the sidebands, and you've got two of them, so you're duplicating the information, and it's a quarter of the power of your carrier. So of course you're all familiar with single sideband, where you get rid of the carrier altogether and one of the sidebands, so you're concentrating all of your available power from your transmitter into that one sideband. So AM is automatically less efficient for that reason. You'll see there 100% modulated carrier with a 1 kHz tone, and your two sidebands 1 kHz above and 1 kHz below the main carrier frequency. When we look at the second diagram, you'll see that the audio speech generates sidebands that go out much wider than that 1 kHz tone is. Typically you would see in an AM transmitter a bandwidth totally of 6 kHz, although with the older transmitters you can get 10 kHz or even more, depending on the tailoring that's done in the modulator and the frequency response of the particular human voice that's using it. So what I've done is I've taken my MFJ80U apart so I can conveniently put a scope probe on the output. This lead comes in from the transceiver. This is just to enable me to get access to it, and the output there goes into the Marconi RF power meter, which, as you can see, is reading just over a watt in output, with our steady carrier that is being generated by a 1 kHz tone from the laptop here, and it goes out through that lead and into the line input on the back of the K3. And I've set this up for 20 volts peak to peak, so it's 5, 10, 15, 20, 5 volts per division on the screen. So what we're now going to do is we're going to look at what happens when we switch to AM. And I need, in this case, to remove the tone, so that's the tone removed. I'm going to switch the transmitter back to receive, adjust the mode down to AM. Now the firmware in this transceiver, like many very recent transceivers, will not allow you to run more than 25% of your carrier power. Let's say, for example, if you have a 100 watt transmitter or transceiver, it will not allow you to run more than 25 watts carrier. Some of the rigs will let you insert carrier right up to the full power, but you won't get the full benefits of the modulation, because as I think I'll demonstrate in a minute, when we modulate an AM carrier, you get the 4 times your peak, 4 times your carrier power on your peaks of audio power. So here we go on to AM, and you should see that the level now of the carrier is half what it was. So we've got just 10 volts peak to peak on there. So what I'm now going to do is I'm going to turn this round so we see the waveform, so we can see the audio modulation envelope when I put the tone on, which is what I'm doing now. And there you see the power, and we're getting 1, 2, 3, 4. So we've got 20 volts peak to peak, which is exactly the same as the peak that we had on our sideband carrier just now generated with the tone. I've now set the carrier power on our unmodulated AM carrier to the 20 volts peak to peak that we were getting just now from the sideband transmitter with the single tone. So this is just a plain unmodulated carrier, and I've made up for the fact that the firmware turns the power down when we go on to AM. So this is what happens now when we put the tone onto the carrier, that we now have 40 volts peak to peak, which is twice what your PA would be able to cope with. Now that is what you would get if you were using something like a DX100 here, which will run 100 watts of carrier and is modulated by a pair of KT88s, which will provide another 75 watts worth of audio power to amplitude modulate the carrier. You'll also see that the power on the RF power output meter has gone up by sort of about half a watt or so on there. And if I remove the modulation, you'll see it goes back down. Now, of course, you don't see that normally when you're operating AM, because the speech is not at a constant 100% duty cycle. So you would expect to see the meter needle flicking up and down a little bit, which is indeed what it does. Here's the same test performed on my vintage valve KW Vanguard transmitter built in the mid-1950s. I'm taking the output from the antenna changeover relay, which is going into the same dummy load, and it's set up on 1.8 megs for the purpose of doing these measurements, the same as with the K3. Bear in mind, if you use top band, your maximum power output in terms of carrier is going to be 8 watts, which equates to 32 watts PEP, which is the maximum legal limit above 1850. I'm going to demonstrate over-modulation on an AM transmitter and why it's undesirable. You'll see that I'm putting my 1 kHz tone into the KW Vanguard, and as I increase the modulation level, the amplitude of the carrier goes up and you get a nice waveform, you get a nice rounded waveform, and the carrier itself at the baseline doesn't break up. And you can see as I reduce the carrier level, the amplitude of the carrier reduces likewise. Now, if I increase the carrier back and overdo it so that we overmodulate, you'll see that the waveform flat tops at the top. This will cause distortion, and you get the breakup of the carrier on the baseline, and that you certainly don't want, because it will cause a lot of splatter and nasty QRM all over the band. Tuning up a boat anchor. Here we have a 1950s KW Vanguard transmitter, which I've got opened up on my workbench, sitting alongside the DX100 as well, which is a higher powered transmitter, runs 100 watts carrier output. Vanguard should run about 40-ish watts or thereabouts, but I'm going to use it on this test on top band. And it's not very efficient on top band because it was a modification, and the Pi network isn't quite adequate, quite the right values to get the maximum power out. So I'm going to go through the tune-up procedure for those of you that are not familiar with tuning up old AM rigs or valve rigs. It's quite easy. Of course, what you've got to do is you've got to, because you're not using a transceiver, you're using a separate transmitter and receiver. So you'd have the receiver, something like the HRO or the AR88 that I have over there, which I use with this transmitter. So I would tune the signal in on the receiver, and I would just adjust the VFO until I zero beated the carrier of the other station that I'm going to call, or until I've got it on the frequency I want it on. So having done that, we have to make sure that we have enough grid drive, and this is the drive to the final valve, which in the KW Vanguard is a 6146, which you can see down there in the PA box glowing quite nicely. So what we do is we make sure we've got our band set up. So I'm set up for 160, and we quickly go on to transmit, and we look at the grid current. Now this needs about 2.5 milliamps of grid current, so I will peak up the drive using this control, and you'll see that I can peak the drive that way. I've got more than enough drive that I need, and it's important not to overdrive the valve because you can cause harmonics and other nasty things as well. So then we need to go into our PA current, and we need to adjust the PA tuning until we get a nice dip. There we are. Now what should happen is the maximum power should occur in the dip if everything's working right. This doesn't quite work that way. I get more power with a slightly higher current due to an anomaly in this particular transmitter, which I've never got round to sorting out. So I'm going to tune it up properly. So that's there, that's dipped, and adjust the loading control to get the maximum power, and we're virtually there. And as you can see on the 25 watt scale, I'm getting 15 watts out on the power meter. I've got an old commercial Pi mobile insert in this, and I'm going to go to the modulation now, and you can see as I speak into the microphone the modulation meter kicks up. You'll see the PA meter kicks up very slightly, and if I look on the power meter kicks up as I modulate, and if I look at the screen you'll see the modulation envelope there on the oscilloscope. A lot of AMers use vintage equipment, as you've seen with my KW Vanguard. So let's just have a look at some of the rigs that you're likely to hear on the air. I mentioned the DX100, and here it is on the bench in bits. The modulator valves are unplugged at the moment because I have an issue with those. But you'll see that there's quite a lot of heavy metalwork, big transformers in there. And that's what's needed if you're going to have high level modulation, plate and screen modulation. There is a cheaper way around that, which you can achieve up to 95% modulation with, and that's what they call series gate or carrier control. And that uses just a pair of double triodes, things like 12AX7s, 12AU7s and those sort of things, and it screen modulates the PA valve. Series gate is different to normal plate and screen modulated AM in that you set the residual carrier power somewhat lower than the normal full output power, and as you modulate that carrier power goes up with the modulation as well, and it's a very effective and economic way of getting some reasonably decent sounding AM. Here's some examples. There's the Heathkit DX40, which is very popular, crystal controlled, the DX60 and the Lafayette Starflight. I had a Lafayette Starflight in the early 70s and worked a lot of DX on there, including when 10 and 15 meters closed down, VK and ZL, and lots of Ws on 20 meters. A lot of people home brewed their own equipment, but after World War II a lot of army surplus equipment came onto the market, and of course some manufacturers started to make transmitters and receivers for the amateur market. Here's a few examples of some great British inventions. The Panda equipment, the Panda Cub, which was a low power transmitter about 40-50 watts, similar to the KW Vanguard, and the bigger brother, the Panda PR120V. And then there was the big Lab Gear LG300, which had an 813 in the PA and a separate modulator. And seen in this photograph with its original owner, the late G3YPZ, is a mini-mitter, which was anything but mini. And that was the transmitter that I had my first DX contacts on when I was a member of the Harlow Radio Club, G6UT, back in the late 1960s. It ran a pair of 807s in the PA, modulated by a pair of 807s, and had some mercury vapour rectifiers in there to provide the EHT. Top Band was a very popular band for AM in the 1950s and 60s, and there were some rigs specially made to cover that band with limited power, 10 watts DC input for example, the famous Kodar 85 being one example, and the KW160 being another. And there are still a number of these rigs to be heard on the air. Turning to World War II surplus, there is of course the infamous number 19 set, which you could get for 10 bob in the days when I was a shortwave listener in the late 60s. G3YPZ and several other people are using these on the air these days. Then there's also the Collins TCS12 transmitter and receiver. Several people use these, including GW8TBG on 5 megs. And there is the T1154 1155, and there are a number of these still on the air as well. Coming up to date, a very effective method of getting good high-level AM is with Class E modulation, and GW8LJJ, Eric, has got some kits available for making your own, and there are a number of these on the air, and they sound very, very good indeed. And here's a very smart unit built by Les, G3YPZ, over at Nottingham. My first introduction to AM was my introduction actually to amateur radio. My uncle had bought me an old Marconi CR300 receiver for my 13th birthday in 1966. He said, listen there on the trawler band and you'll hear the local hams talking. And sure enough I did. I tuned in, there was this big signal from Les Cox, G3PRN, who lived just down the road from me and whose son Graham was in my class at school. That of course got me an introduction, and Les and his ex-YL Hilda, G3YEB, were instrumental figures in me getting my licence. Hilda taught me Morse and Les taught me a lot of the theory. So the Harlow net in those days used to be a big affair. Up to 30 stations would be on at lunch times and in the evenings. Lots of people with mobiles using very large mobile whips on vans and cars, usually 8 feet long, usually centre loaded. And in the case of Ernie, G3ERN, who himself was a very famous figure, this van with a large horizontal piece of the aerial going on the roof and a whip sticking up at the top. So let's listen to G3NLD operating mobile with G3TLJ seen here in this photograph along with G3ERN, and then finally G3IPG mobile driving around the lanes near Harlow in Essex in the mid-1960s.
So as I say, I have dropped right down now to a lower level than we were, so I wonder what sort of signal you're getting from me now, Vic. G3 PHK to take it. You have G3NLD mobile with possibly G3TLJ listening. Come in, Vic.
G3 PHK, G3NLD stroke mobile from G3 Texas, London, Japan. Ted, I'm copying you now. 9 plus 40, G3 PHK to transmit G3 TLJ by.
Between the hills. Surprising how hilly the country is this side of Shearing. When you compare it going in the other direction, say to Hatfield Heath. Now I feel my microphone's floating down onto my tummy at the moment. It's slipped. I must make a little clip for it, Les. Going under 1 or 2 trees at the moment, just taking it easy around these narrow...
These recordings of course come before the days of 2-metre FM and repeaters. In those days most local nets were on top band AM. You hadn't got the benefits of a repeater to boost your signal, so you had to work at your antenna system and make sure that you could radiate over a decent distance. Top band AM still exists these days for local nets. There's a net in Essex that gets on 1908 most afternoons. I can hear them here in Lincolnshire with quite good signals. And also the remnants of the Spalding net still gather on Sunday mornings at 11 o'clock on 1975. Here's a recording of G3MMS Gordon, who lives in Bourne, Lincolnshire, about 30 miles away from me, received here on ground wave.
G8LDW and the group, G3MMS. Yeah, I think if you're going to stay legal at this end of the band, I think your maximum power input to the aerial is about 6 watts on AM.
The ground wave range on top band for AM with decent antennas is probably about 30 miles reliably during the day. But of course after dark, when propagation comes in, you can work up and down the UK. And here's some examples of recent contacts on 160 metres where we usually use 1977. And you'll hear G4FIN using a code R85, and there's G4EPL, who we mentioned earlier on, using his Class E transmitter.
Anyway, the name's Kevin, Kilo Echo Victor India November, and the QH is a small village near Northampton. I've got your location is here in Long Sutton.
Yeah, G3YPZ, G4EPL, okay, John, yeah, fine, good signal also, 5 and 9, which is quite good, it's early, isn't it? I know it's dark, but it's still sort of not 5 o'clock yet, so the band's doing well. I've just heard you on 80 metres talking to Mervyn. I've been tuning around, you see, and monitoring, and I heard you talking to Mervyn, but it got very... I could have gone and put the ATU out, because I can't sort of switch straight on it.
80 metres is by far and away the most popular band for AM in the UK at the moment. Activity is centred around 3615, and most of it takes place during the day, from the very early mornings and again late in the afternoon, depending on the season. Of course, in midsummer, when the D-layer absorption is at its maximum, you don't get very much in the way of propagation during the day. The frequency does suffer from QRM from data, and when the skip comes up, you get a lot of continental SSB who don't seem to pay any regard to the fact that the frequency is in use by AM operators. But it's a great frequency to use when it's quiet, and you'll hear a variety of different characters on the band. The Vintage and Military Amateur Radio Society run their net on Saturday mornings from about 8:30, and you'll hear a variety of vintage, amateur, military and indeed homebrew rigs on that net, and they get many participants. So some of the characters you'll hear may be GW8TBG, G3XGW, G4VUN, G0TBI and many more.
Radio on your Icon 7300, and you have a HRO there. You're doing a bit of CW at the moment, and you're also working on another transmitter chassis which is on the floor of your shack. We heard that on the earlier net. I don't know whether you copied any of that, Bronick, but it's back to you.
Yeah, G0OER from Mike 0 Delta Alpha Foster. Yes, solid copy actually, Paul. Very nice signal actually. You could do a bit more. I think apart from that, very easy to copy. Signal strength about 8 to 9, so you're not the strong.
Leicester, isn't it, where you are? You don't leave too long, but I understand the noise problems are a proper pain and do give problems. 7-3 to those that signed last time, Ray, Ian, and I think that was the only signing stations. And okay, Colin, on mentioning sea houses, I've spent a bit of time sitting in there parking, looking over sea houses. I know exactly what you're talking about. And I certainly wouldn't want a lobster on my nose. They do have rather large pincers, don't they? Anyway, there you go. I think we've covered the lobster thing. And yes, okay with the vegetarianism. G3YJO, M1PBC.
PBC, G3YJO. KS about on frequency and I think all managed okay. Conditions are sort of interesting this morning. The signal's not terribly strong. It's around about the 9 plus 10 to 9 plus 15, but there's some, as has been mentioned, quite a bit of QSB, fairly rapid. But it's a quiet band, so everybody's up CEQ5, no problems.
Quite often you'll get continental stations from Holland or France calling into the VMARS nets or the morning nets or the afternoon nets on 3615. There's also activity from Holland around 3705, and you can quite often hear those stations over here, and from France on 3600. And of course the Americans are big on AM, and they use 3885, which unfortunately is outside our allocation, but there have been some contacts made with the States when they ventured down into our portion of the band. Here's an example of some of those big American signals, WA3VJB and Company.
And I dialed up on the other receiver momentarily, and apparently Washington State is coming in on 3875 or wherever the gathering is up higher in the band. So the band is definitely turning long while we continue to have this fairly short propagation too. KA1KAQ in the group, WA3VJB.
People, WA3VJB in the group, KA1KAQ, and welcome back, Budley. This makes, what, 4 times tonight, I think. So you now hold the record. You beat out Rob by 1. I've managed to work Rob, W1AEX, and Budley on every frequency that I've been on tonight. So actually not Rob, because I guess I didn't catch Rob on 3880 when I was up there. Oh darn, I didn't catch either, Bud, sorry. There it goes. Oh well. Well anyway, yeah, Bruce, W90TN, I'm not sure if he's still in there or not, but Bruce, I think you said you got your transmitter.
We in the UK are very, very lucky to have an allocation in the 60 metre band of 5.317 megahertz for AM use. Only the UK, as far as I'm aware, have this frequency, and AMers have been making good use of it. It doesn't suffer from the QRM from sideband stations from Europe that we suffer on 80 metres and the other bands, so generally it's possible to have a QSO without too much interference. The band is very unpredictable in that QSB can rapidly set in and propagation drop out very quickly. Most activity on AM takes place during the day, and again this is seasonal because the propagation characteristics change. During midsummer, for example, it's possible to have AM QSOs right into the late night and even into the early hours of the morning. But during the winter months, the band opens at dawn and closes at dusk, and then the skip becomes long. Here's a few examples of some wonderful AM contacts that have been held recently on 60 metres.
Right. Yeah, I heard you calling a little while back actually, and wondered if you'd had any contacts in the meantime. This would have been about 10 minutes ago when I was down in the house just looking on the Western SDR, and I thought, conditions must be, or you must think conditions are up to something. So anyway, very good afternoon to you. I'm on the TCS, 25 watts, carbon light, and I've been on 60 for quite a while actually. So Ronan was telling me the other day that he's had 1 or 2 contacts as conditions seem to be quite good for inter-G. So I hope it's dropping okay. G3YPZ, G3XGW.
Okay, now, got it muted. I'm monitoring my signal into hot green, and it seems to, your signal was really coming up into there, and mine is at the moment, so, as you say, John, the band could... This frequency could fade out on us at any time. But we'll keep going as long as we can, John.
Yeah, okay, G1DN set from GW3UZS. So, okay, Graham. And he varying strength with me from about S8 up to about 10 over 9. So quite a bit, a lot of QSB then. Okay, we've worked before. Yeah, I seem to recall the call sign. But when you called in, you had a lovely signal with me, but you went down a little bit during that over. But anyway, I'd more or less closed on the frequency there, but thanks for giving a shout. Nice to say hello.
40 metres. 7143 used to be the frequency to use in years gone by, but with the long skip conditions for the last few years on 40, the band has been a challenge for anyone wanting to work into UK on 40. However, in recent months, I've been using the top end of the band, around 7190, and working into Europe, into Ireland and into Scotland, either with my K3, the 7300 or the DX100. Recently, I had a pleasurable contact with Marco, IK2LFF, in the evening on 40 metres, who I heard calling CQ. Marco was streaming his QSOs on YouTube, and here's his recording of my signal received down there in Italy.
Golf 3 Yankee Papa Zulu, Golf 3 Yankee Papa Zulu, G3YPZ.
Ha!
Okay, Claudio, just a second. I heard G3YPZ, John. A pleasure to hear you here in AM on 40 meters. You're loud and clear, you're 5 and 9, and it's so good. The audio quality in AM is absolutely astonishing. Name is Marco. I'm living close to the Swiss border on the lake of Lugano. And actually, I'm QSOing with HB9OAU. Mic back to you, John. G3YPZ, if you don't mind. Afterwards, you will pass the mic to Claudio, HB9OAU. This is IK2LFF, over.
IK2LFF, I think is the call sign, Marco. Good afternoon, good evening from Golf 3 Yankee Papa Zulu. You are 5 and 9, and you have my name okay as John. I'm not sure if I'm copying HB9OAU, but we'll give a try. HB9OAU from Golf 3 Yankee Papa Zulu.
Roger, John. G3YPZ. IK2LFF, HB9OAU, Alpha Mike. 5 and 9 also to you too, John. Very good audio and very good signal here, John. Living in south part of Switzerland.
As well as the activity in Europe on 40 metres, there's activity in Australia. And here's a famous AMer, Victor Kilo 2 Bravo Alpha, on 40 metres in a net.
I suppose that it's a good thing to see the money being used for what it really should be used for, flood damage. Yeah, all right. Anyway, I don't have too much here. I just thought I'd call in and say good day all round. VK, I don't know who I go to. I tried to write it down, Steve, and I just couldn't write it down. You're going so fast. So whoever goes after me, please go. This is VK2 Boat Anchor.
VK2 Whiskey Fox.
And one of the great characters of AM in the States was a character known as Ashtabula Bill, W8VYZ, a well-known homebrewer and old-timer. I used to work Bill on 20 metres, 15 and 10 metres, but here's a recording of him on 40 metres and a bit of vintage film of him showing us around his homebrew, old-fashioned AM station.
Here it goes, I don't know what I'm going to do. You got to get somebody to put me an antenna on. Hey, I'll turn it back to you, little guy. Good evening in there. W4WRZ. W8VYZ.
Okay, W8VYZ. W8VYZ. WA4WRZ, a little QRM. They're not bothering you at all here, Bill. They may be bothering me, but
well, this is the QTH of W8VYZ, and here is Bill. How you doing, Bill?
Salute.
Salute. AM forever.
All right, AM forever. All
Yeah.
right.
This is the main operating position of your fine station here. My God, you got. What you using for it? What's the main station receiver, Bill?
BC348.
Okay, which is this guy right here.
That's a Q and that's the R.
That's the R model. You use a with that use a converter, I guess.
Yeah.
Which one? The RME up there?
Well, you just converter on that one. The homebrew converter on that one.
Okay, the homebrew converter is
behind the peanuts.
Oh, behind the peanuts. Hey, I like that old-fashioned dial on there.
Ain't that an antique?
That is fantastic. Absolutely. I got some
low dial, all right.
I got some low light.
Ashtabula Bill, who became a silent key sadly some years ago, was a big signal on 20 metres. 14286 was the frequency the Americans used, and boy is that hard work in the middle of Kilowatt Alley with all the sideband stations around there. I worked Bill a number of times, and also Chuck, K1KW, and various other people in the States over a period of years during the last solar cycle. Nowadays, some of the activity is up around 14,300 or 14,330, but finding a clear frequency is often a challenge. Here's a contact I had earlier on in the year with KB3RHR, Craig, who's running high power, the full legal limit, with a very efficient station, and I managed to get a 5 and 5 from him on my KW Vanguard with about 30 watts.
Okay, I got Yankee Papa Zulu. I got Yankee Papa Zulu. Yankee Papa Zulu. Give me the suffix, or give me the prefix. Give me the prefix. Give me the prefix several times. A Yankee Papa Zulu. Go ahead.
And finally, Carlos, CT4 Romeo Kilo, who I worked with my Vanguard to his vintage Geloso station as well. And he is a big signal who's also active on 80 meters AM, as well as the other bands.
Very, very good transmission. I'm now receiving you on my Yaesu FR100B receiver. I notice my frequency is moving a little bit. And I'm now transmitting on my KW Vanguard. I'm now transmitting on my KW Vanguard transmitter.
I have had contacts on 17 meters on AM across the pond, but the band is a little bit narrow, so you have to be lucky to find a clear frequency and stay out of everyone else's way. However, 15 meters over the last 2 cycles has proved to be a really interesting band. And at the time of doing this lecture in December 2020, the band has only recently opened up again at the beginnings of the new sunspot cycle. And with solar flux indexes up to 115, it has provided regular and good contacts across the pond. Here's a selection of contacts on 15, starting with one I had on the west coast with KW7Y in the last cycle, and coming bang up to date with QSOs in this past week.
Let me know what frequency you're on, and I'll tune this thing in exactly. Okay. 21.420 according to my frequency counter, and it's spot on the dial on this Johnson Valiant that you can't set it within a couple of kilohertz, so I'm right on frequency. I was just going to see if I can. Oh, I was going to tune up for 125 watts. Let's see, it is 125 watts. Let me adjust the grid current here a little bit. And I'm always amazed how accurate the CFO is on this Valiant. And turn the grid current up a bit, which should help the modulation a little bit.
John, I'm going to be on all day tomorrow. All morning long tomorrow, starting at about, well, maybe I'll start at this time, 1400 or so, or maybe 1500. And I'll be yelling and screaming on AM. And maybe, John, maybe next week, I'll actually drag out the boat anchor equipment and set her all up. All I need to do is everything's ready to go. I just got to put the key.
By the way, I'm using my transmitter, Geloso G222 and SP600 receiver, about 50 watts into the 2-element tri-band. G3YPZ V3OWV.
PZ?
Yeah, G3YPZ V3OWV. Yeah, I'm using my IC7300 as a frequency meter at the moment, so I'm just correcting for the drift as the Geloso warms up.
Well, no problem. One is very clean. I think about a 5 and 6 or 7 maybe. I have to check. G3YPZ, Victor Echo 2, X-ray kilo, over.
Roger. I am 9 Foxtrot Echo, and very good. But Kilo Uniform Romeo Tango, so 5 by 7, 57 into the island of Trinidad. QSOs. Okay, QSOs. Thank you very much for the 5 by 5. And thank you for the lovely contact. 7 degrees and all the best. From 9 Zulu for Foxtrot Echo in Trinidad. Bye-bye.
And now we come to 10 meters. That is my favourite band, going back to 1970 when I first got licensed, when I got my first HF radio, which actually was running single sideband with inserted carrier. And I met K2UTC in White Plains, New York, who was running about 30 watts of AM, and had daily contacts with him and many more AM stations during that solar cycle. And when the cycle came up again, I was back on AM, as well as messing around on FM, and back again for every other cycle since then. And 10 meters, of course, has that wonderful amount of space in it, and we have a dedicated AM window from 2900 to 29.1. So here's a selection of QSOs from the last solar cycle, and I'm hoping it's not too long before we get the solar flux index high enough for regular transatlantic contacts again on 10 meters.
Yep. No, the radiation angle thing. Well, if you talk about it, I won't bore you more with it, but it's very interesting. And just for information, today is a low angle day. All 4 antennas seem to be the best position, whereas the past week or so, it hasn't been the case. It's been the higher angle stuff. So today it's low angle day. Every day is a new day. It's fascinating to see the difference. And anyway, so that's that. Well, I do remember I was first licensed in 1963, but I really didn't start operating the high bands until the late 60s, early 70s. I was building my own stuff. I was still a teenager in high school, and I was building transmitters out of parts from old TV sets with vacuum tubes and so forth. And I was lucky to get something working on 20 meters, let alone 15 or 10. So that was basically a 80 meter, 40 meter AM operator in the early mid-60s. But later, capabilities improved and my technical skills improved. I was able to put stuff up on the build things for the higher bands, and of course these days it's all different. But you're right, I remember all the heterodynes. My God, I kind of liked that. That was real radio, and I remember working a number of stations in Russia in the past, like couple of sunspot cycles. I think in the late the 70s and 80s, everyone was running homemade transmitters, and it was just loaded with a lot of these signals. But the one characteristic they all had is they were very unstable frequency.
Some pretty serious maintenance. The plan was to, I think you know, I'm feeding this with 300 ohm ribbon feeder. I've got 2 lengths about one going to each element, and they're each about 30 meters long, and they're tuned in the shack here with two Z matches. So I'm driving one element and tuning the other up as a reflector, which is a very good system. But we were planning to put the tuner up on the tower and tune it remotely. But the quads are fairly high maintenance, and I'm tempted to look at the idea of going for a Yagi, but I don't like the idea of compromising, with traps and things like that. So the most attractive option would be something like the stepper.
From here, Mervyn. So I wonder what you've been working on a band here. Have you made any real interesting contacts? I heard a UK to California contact yesterday. I thought that was just stellar. I looked up the guy in California on QRZ, and he was indeed in California, unless he was vacationing somewhere. I wasn't able to hear him, which is a pretty good indicator that he may have been where his call sign says he was. So this is just great. Back to you, Mervyn. See how it's holding up here. Turn the heat on this morning. It's nice and toasty in here now, and all the spent, wasted energy from the finals going in the basement and heating that, so that'll pay off. GW8 TBG from W2VW.
And here's a little clip of a difficult QSO with VK2BA in the last cycle as well. I'm hoping we're going to get better conditions in the forthcoming one.
Another couple of DV would make a big difference, John. 10 more DV would make a big difference. Roger, Roger, quite quickly. So, on the Yagi, and we're running the 13 transmitter. It's all valve.
Un moment. No 500 milliwatt, John.
Yeah, I'm copying you on 500 milliwatts. Make a longer transmission, Frank, over.
Yes. 500 milliwatt. Yes, my a very good estimation with my power reducer. Have 6
One. So how's the copy? Louis 5 Kilo Alpha Papa November 1 Echo uniform.
Fantastic, Barry. I worked again with my lunchbox CB1, 500 milliwatt. But I listen with this regenerative receiver, absolutely fantastic.
It's very interesting modulation you have. The carrier disappears when you're talking. When you stop talking, the carrier comes back. So I don't know if it's a suppressed carrier type modulation, but very interesting. I'm watching it on my pan adapter.
I've also had QSOs on 12 meters, which behaves in a similar way to both 15 and 10. But again, it's a fairly narrow band, so it's difficult to find enough space to have decent AM QSOs without suffering QRM from sideband stations. The other thing to mention is the question of phase distortion on AM. When you're working ground wave, when the signal is coming directly to you, or space wave as at VHF, you will not get any phase distortion. The signal will just be perfectly clear. But any of the ionospheric modes, except sporadic E, which strangely doesn't suffer from this, will suffer from phase distortion as the signal goes up and down. The sidebands go out of phase with the carrier, and you get that typical type of sound that you would associate with Radio Luxembourg on medium wave in the old days. However, that's one of the things that you have to put up with if you use AM. You can use a synchronous detector, which the K3 provides, which gets rid of that problem to a large degree. So, let's look now on the VHF bands. There is sporadic activity on both 6 and 4 meters on AM, and not much left on 2 meters. But I've had a number of good QSOs in the past year using my IC9700 in the AM mode, and it does work very, very well indeed over quite long distances.
It's very windy down here. I'm not sure what it's like up your way. It's very windy. So I've got the slimline mask I had when you picked up the X100 the other day. So it's slammed down to about 30 feet at the moment. So yeah, all good stuff. Anyway, I wonder what if you're running an amplifier there, John, or is that just the basic 9700 G3YPZ Golf 4 Hotel Tango Zulu, over? But it is nice to use the old-fashioned mode. I use this on HF as well. I was on 15 meters day before yesterday, and worked WB5 INR right up the top end of 15 on 21.420, and he was a very good signal. He was 5 and 9 over here. And that was only the
G3YPZ, G4XPZ. Okay. Well, I think that's okay. The PEP power looks to be about 60 or 70 watts, which should be okay. It's a 160 watt amplifier.
So if that's modulating okay, so I've just put the mic gain up to 100, but reading you fine. So excellent. As I say, it looks like it's modulating okay on the band scope. Yeah, that looks very good. Next time you come on, I'll try and I'll put the recorder on and record you. G3YPZ, G4XPZ.
Yeah. So there we have the AM mode explored from 160 meters up to 2 meters, and of course it'll work on 77s and anywhere else you care to try it. Why not give it a go? I look forward to seeing you on the air. 7-3 from G3YPZ.